my area of specialisation was environmental law. And so if you count that, I started in 1975, which was just in the last days of the Whitlam government. God bless Gough, he passed away this week. Some of us, more than others, will pay our respects to him, I suspect. He was a very interesting character. But it was a time when I started thinking about the role of environmental law, the role of law in terms of protecting the environment, just on the heels of what had been a very active period of development, the first stages of development of environmental law in this country. And if I jump from then until September of 2013 and look at what has happened in this country in the last 12 months, looking back over those 40 plus years of development, what we're now seeing is a staggering regression or retreat from all of the arrangements that have been put in place steadily, piece by piece, over those 40 plus years since around 1975 by the current federal government. And it is that topic that I really want to speak to tonight. But I want to do it from a historical perspective because I find myself almost in the unique position of having been involved in this country almost longer than anyone else in an active way in engaged examination of these arrangements that the Commonwealth Government has put in place over all those years. And I think that it's important to see the current situation from that historical perspective. Now, in fact, you don't have to go back to 1975. You can go back to the year that Australia became a nation, 1901, to begin the story, because in that year when the Australian Constitution was adopted, even though we actually had quite a rich history of engagement with environmental matters way back in the 19th century. There's a wonderful book that I always like to look to, J.M. Powell's History of Environmental Management in Australia, which tells the story of the very active engagement of predominantly British and Irish settlers with the environment in Australia in the 1800s. It's a really fascinating read. There were societies, etc. I know this is not a historical society, but in fact, you might have thought that by 1901, the founders of this country might have thought to mention something about the environment in the Constitution, but the fact is they did not. As a country now, we are in a minority. I think of the 196 or whatever nations in the world, there are now no more than about 30 or so that do not have an explicit mention of the environment in their constitution. But we are one of those for historical reasons, and the fact that we don't change our constitution all that readily or easily. And the only thing that the founding fathers thought about at that time was the River Murray. And so there were some clauses in the Constitution, section 106 in particular, mainly designed to ensure that the Murray River remained a navigable water body, that you could get vessels up and down. But within something like 14 years of federation, we saw the establishment of the River Murray Commission. We saw legislation to provide for the installation of weirs and management arrangements on the River Murray. In the 1930s, I was just talking to somebody earlier, I think, about the soils problems in Australia when we started to have the first major dust storms and land degradation resulting to the loss of topsoil. The Commonwealth commissioned inquiries into soils. By the late 1940s, after World War II, the Commonwealth, whilst it was not really actively engaging in environmental matters, realised there was going to be a rapid expansion in population in the post-war period and decided to grant funding to state governments in 1949, I think it was, to enable them to create public housing. And so the Commonwealth Government used a clause that was used widely from time to time, section 96 of the Constitution, which says that the Commonwealth can give monies to the states and it can put any conditions it likes on those grants. These what are called specific purpose grants. And this is how the Commonwealth, to this day, that's how it disperses the GST payments to the states under section 96 grants. What the Commonwealth said in 1949 is, well, gee, we're going to have this massive expansion. We better do something about planning our cities. So as a result, it made a condition on this money for public housing, in this state for the Housing Trust, that the states would adopt land use planning laws, town and country planning laws as they were then known. And so that's how we got our first truly environmental laws across the country, the planning laws that to this day still are the basic mechanism for regulating what development can occur on land, state by state by state. It was a result of a Commonwealth initiative, a Commonwealth, if you like, example of foresight in terms of what would be needed. But having said all of that, in the end, it has been the states that have had the most traditional and significant role in managing our environment. And the question that now arises, I think, is, well, what is the proper balance in terms of the roles and responsibilities of our three levels of government, not forgetting local government? What is the proper balance between, on the one hand, the federal government, then the states and the territories? The two territories of ACT and Northern Territory are effectively states now. They have their own parliamentary governments, and then local government. And there have been long-standing discussions and debates about that topic, particularly since the 1970s. And they continue to this day, and we've seen the pendulum swing backwards and forwards in that matter. Now, to what's been happening in the last 12 months in this country with respect to this subject. We have had since 1992 an organisation called COAG, the Council of Australian Governments. It basically replaced the old Premier's councils that used to sit around the table and try and cut up the budget each year. And COAG has driven a lot of major initiatives in this country. One of the most interesting ones, I think, very early in its piece was its efforts with respect to competition policy. And the national competition policy in the early 1990s, coming out of COAG, resulted in two very significant things for the environment. Basically the privatisation of water and the privatisation of energy. So we saw coming out of this competition policy a theory which I think had a very strong core in Reaganomics, if I can put it that way, in free market economy theory, that if you can create a market in water and trade your rights to water, that will lead to the highest and the best and most efficient use of water. And similarly, if you can create a system in which power is generated privately rather than as a public good or a public product, then the competition between power companies will ensure that you, the consumer, get the best possible outcome. I'm not sure if we're standing tonight, but we will all say that was an outstanding success as an experiment. But that was a COAG outcome, okay? And I just mentioned that in passing because I always like to have a crack at that one, I'm so sure it worked. What came out of COAG was a whole lot of arrangements around environmental and other matters. But when COAG met in December of 2013, shortly after the federal election, there had up until that point been a subgroup of COAG, a number of what are called ministerial councils. And in the case of environment, that was called the Standing Council or Committee, I think it was called Standing Committee on Environment and Water. So every year the federal and state and territory environment ministers got together in that subcommittee of COAG and talked about this idea of shared approaches and what the Commonwealth would do, what the states would do. And this is an arrangement which actually dates back to 1972. The Australian Environment Council was established in 1972, and I think Moss Cass was the then Minister of Environment at the federal level and chaired the first meetings of the Australian Environment Council. From 1972 through to 2013, there was a continuous lineage of ministerial councils dealing with environment, water resources, etc., etc. However, last December, the federal government put to and got COAG to agree that it was no longer necessary for COAG to have an environment ministerial council, and it was abolished. So there was no longer any formal forum within this country for those ministers responsible for the environment to actually sit around the table and decide how they could collaboratively and collectively manage the environment. I think that's a truly remarkable development in its own right. I happen to sit on the board of the Environment Protection Authority in this state, and I learned this week that the environment ministers, including the federal environment minister, are actually meeting anyway They've decided they just can't live without seeing each other, so they are still getting together. But there's no longer any process through which the outcomes of their meetings can be fed up into that COAG system so as to have the endorsement of the premiers and the prime ministers. And I think that's a very unfortunate development. But that's just one of many. And one of the first things that was decided by Prime Minister Abbott was to hand back to the states under the on the basis that there is too much green tape in this country, as it's called, green tape, the powers that the Commonwealth Government currently has to decide whether to approve projects that would impact on matters of national environmental significance under our federal law called the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC Act. Now, that Act was passed in 1999. It was a product, in fact, of the Howard government, although the preparations for it began in the last days of the Keating government. Under the EPBC Act, matters of national environmental significance include projects that might impact on a World Heritage Area, on any Ramsar wetland of international significance, on any site where there are listed endangered species or ecological communities. So a whole range of things that are covered under listings maintained under that Act. Anything that relates to nuclear activities, including the Olympic Dam in South Australia. Anything that relates to activities in our Commonwealth marine waters, which includes BHP's operations in the Great Australian Bight, where they're currently exploring, wanting to do deep drilling into the ocean bed for deep sea bed gas. And so there is a whole range of things. And most recently, in response to the coal seam gas issue, what is called the water trigger. Any activity that may have a significant impact on water resources is now also covered under this EPBC Act. And what the Abbott government has decided is to hand back to the states the power to decide whether or not, or first of all, to decide how to assess any project that is caught by this legislation, and secondly, the power to decide whether to approve the project and if so, what conditions to put on it. Now, there is a tag that has been attached to this. It's called the one-stop shop process. Have you heard of this or not? Has anyone heard of it? It's the one-stop shop process. And so there's been tremendous opposition to this from within the environment movement and the community. I do think that survey is very indicative of where public opinion sits on this matter. So that's a very interesting development to see that survey having been done. And whether this will succeed or not is a very interesting question now, because the Abbott government introduced into the federal parliament earlier this year some legislation to help this one-stop shop process go through, and it included in it a provision that the water trigger, which is in the Act, would also be handed back to the states. And there's a bit of detail here I won't go into, but that one was exempted originally from the one-stop shop. So just in the last 2 weeks, Mr Palmer has reached an agreement with the Greens to support Labor to defeat this amending legislation. This is a somewhat unexpected development, I must say, but nevertheless, the government looks like it is going to have to let this bill go. And those who've been opposing it are saying, oh, well, now the one-stop shop cannot proceed. Well, that's not quite right, because under the one-stop shop is actually proceeding under the current legislation. And the way that it is being implemented is that the current legislation says that the Commonwealth can enter into what's called a bilateral agreement, a contract in effect, a two-party contract, the Commonwealth and each jurisdiction in the country, each state and each territory can contract whereby the Commonwealth says, we now hand over to you the job of making the decisions under this Act. And so the Commonwealth has decided to go first with Queensland. So it's in the process now of finalising the bilateral agreement with Queensland. New South Wales government is close on its heels. The Tassie government has followed pretty quickly, and South Australia is in negotiations with the Commonwealth on this matter. And in the end, I suspect that, well, there's two ways in which this may still not happen. One is litigation. it may be that unless the states significantly ramp up their environmental legislation, they will not meet the standards that the Act requires for this handover to take place. And I will come clean and confess that I am actually involved with a group of people who are behind the scenes getting ready to prepare for such litigation, state by state, if need be. The other thing, though, interestingly, is that any of these bilateral agreements that might be executed by the Commonwealth with the states will not take effect until they've been ratified by the Federal Parliament. And so it remains to be seen whether Clive Palmer and his party will once again come back and say, well, we will not ratify one of these agreements. And I've been asking the Greens whether their arrangement with Clive Palmer extends to that situation, but I can't get an answer at the moment. They're not talking to me, so I don't know what arrangements have been reached. But watch that space. It will be covered in the press, and it will be very interesting to see what happens. Let me just very quickly talk to you a little bit more about some other retreats that the federal government is currently engaged in, besides the dismantling of the COAG arrangements and the one-stop shop. You may recall there was an attempt to delist 450,000 hectares of recently added World Heritage forest area in Tassie. It took the World Heritage Committee just 15 minutes to dismiss that application by the federal government in what was, I think, one of a number of international embarrassments for it earlier this year. So that was one that didn't succeed. The repeal of the carbon price legislation has been effected, as we all know. So the Clean Energy Act that was passed 3 years ago has now been repealed, and with it there was a proposal to also remove the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the body that was going to use the funds generated from the carbon price to fund biodiversity and other programs. And in its place, the direct action alternative of the federal government is bogged down in the Parliament, because it's not clear whether it will get agreement, although just yesterday it was reported that Mr Palmer has decided that in fact he does like the direct action program, even though he wants to eventually have an emissions trading system. It's almost impossible to predict and to know what the Senate will do on these various matters at the moment. It is a very unusual situation. Whilst the carbon price has gone and the legislation with it, the Commonwealth Government is still continuing to provide something like $10 billion in subsidies per annum to the fossil fuel industry. That's in addition to other fossil fuel subsidies provided at the state level. So not are we no longer actually taxing polluters for their carbon emissions, but we are actually continuing to fund their operations with direct subsidies to the total of $10 billion per year. The renewable energy target for 2020 has been the subject of a review by the Warburton Committee, Dick Warburton, the former chairman of Caltex, and that review virtually recommended the abolition of the renewable energy target. The government has ruled that out as an option and said it won't abolish the renewable energy target, but it looks again as if it's likely that some compromise will be reached this time between Labor and the coalition on the renewable energy target, whereby it will be significantly reduced. And just today, I don't know if any of you have heard of Giles Parkinson, who maintains a very good newsletter called Renew Economy, which I subscribe to. Giles was in Adelaide not so long ago speaking on these matters. He wrote that only in Australia, one imagines, can a proposal by the government to slash the country's renewable energy target by more than half be proclaimed by the experts as a victory for the moderates. Such is the toxic nature of the antipathy of the federal government to all things clean and green, and wind farms in particular. And he notes that Australia will probably become the first country in the world to actually reduce its renewable energy target. We'll have to wait and see where that all ends up. But what he does say is that it almost certainly spells the death of any further wind farm development in this country for the foreseeable future. So we're seeing a significant retreat there. We've seen the Commonwealth Government announce that the recently established new marine reserves that now complete the system of marine reserves around the entire Australian continent is to be completely reviewed, probably with the aim of reducing protections in that system beyond the levels that are there at the moment. We've seen the government defund not only the environmental defenders offices, the community legal centres that are situated in each state around the country. They've had their funding terminated because, amongst other things, they do from time to time support public interest litigation. We've also seen, and I found this very distressing as President of the Conservation Council until recently, the termination after 35 years of the GDESHO scheme, the system, the government voluntary grants to environmental organisations. These are grants of anywhere from $10,000 to about $80,000 to many small, locally based conservation groups and state conservation councils around the country. Those were terminated earlier this year. We've seen threats to redefine the nature of charities to exclude any organisation that engages in any political advocacy, even though the High Court had defined that as a legitimate undertaking or activity of any not-for-profit organisation. And we're seeing threats to actually outlaw and make illegal what are called secondary boycotts, which are attempts to persuade financial institutions or other bodies not to invest, for example, in fossil fuel-related activities. You add all those little bits and pieces together, and this is a concerted attack on civil society, or those sections of civil society who are engaged in advocacy on behalf of the environment at the moment. We've seen the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park now proposed possibly for being listed as a World Heritage in Danger item on the World Heritage Register, and we've seen the approval of the Abbots Point development and the Carmichael coal mine, both of which threaten to severely impact on the quality of the Great Barrier Reef. And we've seen in the budget something like $439 million cut from nature protection programs, and one estimate is that the total reduction in spending on the environment in the current budget is something like $29 billion. A massive walk away from responsibilities in this area. Now, what lies behind this? It's simply a philosophical view that, to put it in its shortest form, the Commonwealth Government view is that the states are sovereign in the area of environment. So to go back to the question I asked you at the very beginning, if you go up to Tony Abbott and his government and ask them what do they think about that question, their answer is it's all for the states to do. It's not for the Commonwealth. And that lies behind their thinking. What has now been announced is that the government intends to undertake the preparation of a white paper through COAG. White paper is like a discussion paper on federal-state relations and roles, in which they hope to canvass a redefinition, to explore a redefinition of the roles and responsibilities of the federal-state governments in this space of environmental management. And that paper is due out in about March of next year. So we will see in this space an ongoing dialogue and discussion in the public arena around what is the proper balance between Commonwealth, state and local government responsibilities in the area of environment. And the Commonwealth has said in relation to this white paper, and I quote, "We need to reduce and if possible end duplication and make interacting with government simpler." Well, that's pretty commendable. It's poor reform, isn't it? I think we probably all agree with that. But what they go on to say is we need to clarify the roles and responsibilities for states and territories so that the states and territories are, as far as possible, sovereign in their own sphere. And in amongst the list of areas for attention under that framework is environment. I'll leave it there. I think that's probably about the right time, isn't it? I've got plenty more I could talk to you about on this topic, but I've tried to just simply give you a little bit of history. I haven't gone through all of what happened in the 70s and the 80s and well into the 90s around this space, and I've got plenty I could talk about there. but I thought it was important just to try to communicate to an interested group of people what is happening at the moment in this country, at the national level, at the federal level, around the environment, and ask you to think about it. Happy to have a Q&A.